I'm Sue Stuart Smith, and I'm a psychiatrist and psychotherapist and author of the recently published book, The Well-Gardened Mind. I'm married to the garden designer Tom Stuart Smith, and together over the last 33 years we've created a garden around our home in Hertfordshire. When we first came to the barn, it was situated in the middle of an arable field. We were surrounded by wheat farming and combine harvesters and so on, and gradually we created a garden in this spot. The garden that we created now encompasses about 4 or 5 acres. It includes a wildflower meadow, a prairie garden, a flower garden and a herbaceous garden at the back and the west side of the garden, and this wonderful sun trap of an enclosed courtyard, which is where I'm standing now. So I set off just over 5 years ago on researching my book. And one of the things that inspired me to do that was noticing my own experiences in the garden. When I first married Tom, I knew nothing about gardening, and if anything, I was a bit of a garden skeptic. I saw it as outdoor housework. Gradually, gardening worked its magic on me, and I particularly love vegetable gardening and actually growing cut flowers in my vegetable garden, because those are my two great loves. So I noticed the beneficial effects on my own state of mind, particularly, over the weekend, at the end of a long week, feeling the stresses of carrying a lot of responsibility at work. I realised when I didn't get the chance to garden, I felt worse. So that was one of the inspirations for writing my book. The other was the story of my grandfather that I'd grown up with, who'd been a prisoner of war in Turkey during the First World War as a very young man. He was lucky to survive, and he'd had the opportunity, when he finally reached home and was physically strong enough, almost exactly 100 years ago, between 1920 and 1921, he embarked on a horticultural rehabilitation programme for servicemen who was suffering from trauma. That really changed his life. It restored him, it gave him a great love of gardening. He was a great self-sufficient gardener, but also a lover of flowers, in particular orchids. He specialised in growing orchids. One of the things that made me particularly curious about flowers was discovering that Sigmund Freud, who I'd studied a great deal in the course of my training, was a great flower lover. In fact, he was an amateur botanist, and in older age, towards the end of his life, he spent a great deal of time in the garden. It was a place where he could replenish himself. I noticed one of the things he said about flowers. He said, flowers are restful to look at. They have neither conflicts nor emotions. And what he was signalling was the way that the beauty of nature can, I think, give us so much without any of the complexities that we might get from human to human relating. So look at these daffodils, which I was thrilled to receive recently. And on this grey day, the yellow is so glowing, it's amazing. They brighten the day enormously. And I think, flowers have an ability to sort of transport us to another place. You look at a bunch of flowers like this and it triggers all sorts of associations. And of course, I know these came from Cornwall, for us here, where they haven't come out yet, of spring to come. You have to remember that flowers are, in terms of their biological function, they are communicators. They evolved to be good at biological signalling, so their function is to attract the insects, the birds, the bats and so on. These are their pollinators. So the life of the plant depends on flowers being good at this. Intriguingly, they also attract us. And I don't think we fully understand why, but there does seem to be a neurobiological element to this. And of course, flowers have all sorts of very powerful cultural associations, as well as personal memories and attachments that we might have. So our response to flowers is actually working on many different levels. But one of the theories about cut flowers is to do with them being what's called a positive emotion inducer. Cut flowers evolved to occupy an emotional niche in the ecosystem. So the team who've developed this theory are based at Rutgers University in the US. According to them, cut flowers started to appear, or cultivated flowers I should say, started to appear very early, about 5,000 years ago. And their hypothesis is that when flowers spontaneously started to appear in the early fields, the Neolithic farmers' fields, people let the ones that they loved most stay. They welcomed them like strays, self-seeded plants that they allowed to flourish. And gradually this led to a selection process, which, you know, the end result of, way down the line, is the cut flower market that we have today. Interestingly, the team at Rutgers, who've done quite a lot of research now on the effects of flowers on us, started through a different route. They were inspired by an experiment that was looking at the effects on people's brains through brain scanning of noxious stimuli, aversive stimuli like snakes and spiders. And they wanted a neutral stimulus as a control, and they used flowers. And it became rapidly apparent that far from being a neutral stimulus, flowers were a very powerful positive stimulus in the brain. In order to understand the effects of flowers on us, we need to know something about the effects of beauty in general. And there are some very interesting brain scan studies carried out at the University of London by the neuroscientist Semir Zeki. He had a belief that beauty was a fundamental response at a biological level. And he wanted to see whether there was a unique signature, if you like, within the brain. So regardless of the form of beauty, regardless of whether it was musical beauty, or he even looked at mathematical beauty or visual beauty, whether there was a signature for it. And he discovered that indeed there was. And what happens in the brain when we have an experience of beauty is the networks that light up are intrinsic to our reward and pleasure systems. And very importantly, they're also linked to the networks for romantic love. So there's a great deal of overlap between love and beauty. These networks are involved in terms of our neurotransmitters with important neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, and our endogenous opioids, our endorphins. All of this adds up to feelings of pleasure and stimulation, but a kind of calm stimulation. What this means is that there's an anti-stress effect. And studies have confirmed that have looked at the impact of cut flowers in the house on people's mood, on their stress levels, and so on. This finding's also been confirmed in hospital patients, for example. So one study carried out at the University of Canvas looked at patients undergoing the removal of their appendix. And they divided the patients into two groups, with identical hospital rooms, each having a television, but only one group had flowering plants in it. And what they found is the patients who had flowering plants near their bed had much lower levels of, for example, anxiety. They had better heart rate readings, blood pressure readings, and importantly, they felt they were in a cared for place. And the other finding that was important in this group was they needed less pain medication. So the authors of that study concluded that flowers were an inexpensive medicine for patients undergoing surgery. So another important ingredient in our response to flowers is through scent. Scent is in many ways one of the most powerful of our senses. It's certainly the most primitive in terms of our evolution. The neurons in our nose communicate directly with the centres for emotion and memory in the brain. And in fact, the centres for emotion and memory in the brain actually evolved from these olfactory neurons. So there's a very, very close link, which is why scent unlocks our feelings and our memories and our associations so powerfully. On top of that, some scents have a direct influence on our neurochemistry. So for example, lavender, which has long been known to be a soothing smell and calming herb, the effects of that help to boost serotonin. Another example is rosemary, which has long been known by herbalists to stimulate cognition and improve memory, for example. And sure enough, it's been found in studies to boost dopamine levels and acetylcholine. So these are intrinsic to both those functions in the brain. The one I love best is the effect of roses on us. The scent of roses has been found to reduce levels of the stress hormone adrenaline in our bloodstream. And one study found that this was by as much as 30%. But there's another ingredient in the effect of roses on us, which I think might help to account for how universally loved the scent of roses is. There's a constituent of the smell which slows down the breakdown of our endogenous opioids, our natural endorphins. And it's thought that this partly accounts for the rose being able to induce in us a feeling of lingering calm. Another important ingredient of the effects of flowers on us is through their colour. Some flowers have such saturated colours, we are just drawn to them. It's very likely that that effect is through our response to beauty, and in particular our endorphins, our natural opioids. But there's also another effect that's important in all of this. On the one hand, we have the intense stimulation of colour of certain flowers. Equally, there's the effects of green on the brain. And green is a calming colour. What all this adds up to is the particular property of flowers, and actually other elements of nature too, to both calm and revitalise us. So on the one hand, we find the calming and pleasurable effects of beauty, but equally the stimulation of aspects like novelty, the patterns that we see in nature that are regular but endlessly varying as well. And what this combines is this to achieve is an effect of stimulation, but not overstimulation, kind of gentle stimulation. And I think people are increasingly drawn to more natural flowers. Some of that is to do with the awareness of the effects on the environment and climate change and so on. But I think there's also a need for some kind of return to nature, that flowers that look too perfect, too manufactured, they're not stimulating us in the same way, in the same fascinating way. They're an object of desire as opposed to a connection with the natural world. I think flowers communicate our feelings of love and care for each other more powerfully than anything else. One study, actually, another Rutgers study, looked at the impact of gifts, different kinds of gifts on people. And what they found was that without exception, flowers elicited what they called a Duchenne smile, a true smile, a spontaneous smile of pleasure. And the other gifts were sort of similar value, but they didn't, at that level, maybe 40% of the time or 60% of the time, but flowers absolutely won, hands down. And at a time like now, when we're in this very, very difficult crisis and still struggling with uncertainty and ongoing social isolation, flowers are more important than they've ever been before. I've certainly sent flowers to a number of friends and my mother and just as a way of reaching out, and I've been very struck by the power of the response I've had to them. think it's a very direct way in which we can bring some joy and some hope into somebody else's home, giving them a gift of flowers. It's easy to underestimate these effects. For example, the charity, the Lemon Tree Trust, which builds gardens in refugee camps in Syria. What they found when they started setting up these gardens was that although there was a real need for food in the camps, 70% of what people wanted to grow was flowers. Don't forget, when the soldiers were in the trenches on the Western Front, they wrote home asking their relatives to send them out flower seeds. And those flowers provided them with a psychological lifeline in order to survive that landscape of death and destruction, which really does show how deep our need for beauty is in terms of psychological survival. I think particularly at the current moment, expressions of care for each other are enormously important. And one of the things we know about care is that it produces a boost in our natural endorphins, our opioid levels. So these are stress reducing and associated with feelings of pleasure and calm. And this effect is present for both the giver and the receiver of care. It's a reciprocal effect. And there are evolutionary reasons why it should have evolved that way. So the person giving the flowers will be getting something of a boost too, through the effect of knowing that they are expressing care for someone they love or who's important to them. I think it's a mistake to think of flower farmers as a non-essential producer. You know, given everything I've been saying, it's clear that flowers, any contact we can have with nature actually, is such an important ingredient of maintaining or helping people manage their mental health, particularly at the moment. Flowers, you know, from the hospital studies and other studies, it's clear they can have an impact on not only making people feel cared for and loved, but also damping down our fear and stress responses. So it's this calming effect, as well as the pleasure and the effects of beauty on us, are so important. I don't think flower farmers should be in any doubt about the value of what they're doing to help us collectively, I think, get through this crisis. I think it's one of the very simple things any of us can do to help support someone we care about at the moment. It's a mistake to see flower farmers as producing a luxury in our lives. You know, for all the reasons I've been talking about, the way that flowers can console us, reduce stress, communicate love and care to each other, and particularly in this time of social isolation. Flower farmers are in that sense providing an essential service, I would say.